Been speaking about fellowship tonight. I want to continue. I'm going to get to give you the O. Maybe we'll finish fellowship one day. I want us to think about this. Last week we spoke about how if you apply, if you learn, if you study the Word of God, that the fruit of the Spirit will come out of that. A pursuit of fellowship is a pursuit of the Word of God, and when you apply it, when you understand it, when you take its promises, the fruit of the Spirit will come out. Tonight I want to take the O, and I want you to think about this. When you pursue fellowship, there'll be an outpouring. You'll never pursue fellowship with God and there'll be nothing in return. When you truly pursue God, when you ask, when you seek, when you knock, when you seek Him, when you try to study, when you serve, when you give, when you pray, whatever it might be, there's always an outpouring. Now, the outpouring might not be what you wanted. It might not be when you wanted it, whatever, but there's always an outpouring. And we can rest in the fact that God is perfect in what He gives us, what He pours out in us and through us and by us is always perfect. But I believe that when you pursue fellowship, and that's our challenge, to pursue intimacy with God, there'll be an outpouring. And that outpouring, the outpouring received from a pursuit of fellowship, overcomes any lack or loss that pursuing it brought with it. I know that's a long mouthful, isn't it? But here's what I say. You will receive an outpouring. There'll be an outpouring from fellowship, but there will be something that is costly in that. There'll be losses in that. When you pursue fellowship, lack and loss will be a part of that. You might lose friends. You might lose time. You might lose there's all, and I want us to think about this tonight. There might be a losses of all kinds, right? But I want to help us understand tonight that there will be losses, there will be hardships, there will be pains in pursuing fellowship. To give your life as a living sacrifice, to seek others, to seek God and to put others first, to love your neighbor as yourself, to deny yourself, take up your cross and simply follow Him. You're going to have to pour out a lot. There'll be a lot, that's a big challenge. But we have to believe and we have to accept that whatever the outpouring is, that what I'm saying is there'll be an outpouring and there'll also be, you have to overcome lack and loss, but the pursuit, the outpouring is always worth it. I want to do something kind of different. I could go, obviously, if I want to make this point, if I want to talk about an outpouring from a pursuit of fellowship that comes at a price, I could have gone to really expensive pursuits. I can take you to Revelation and talk about the martyrs who pursue fellowship, but there was a lack, they lost their life. There was a lack of friendship, a lack of safety, a lack of I could really easily take you to Revelation, to the martyrs, and show you how expensive it's going to be a martyr, but I don't want to do that. I've talked about it a lot, and I want to make it more prevalent, although we're living in days where that's going to be prevalent soon enough. We could talk about Daniel and how he refused to give up praying, and he ended up in a lion's den. He lost his liberty, he lost his freedom, he lost whatever. There's a lot, right? I could talk about the 3 Hebrew boys who refused to worship and got thrown in the fiery furnace. I could talk about Peter upside down on the cross. But I want to go to a story that I love. I'm going to go to a different passage first, and then we'll get to this story, and it's kind of humorous story in a way. But I want to make it more relevant to us, and I think you'll see that here in a minute. In Acts chapter 12, if you go there real quick. Pursuing God comes with a price. James and John, the fishermen, the brothers, the ones who said, we'll follow with you, the 2 of the original disciples, they'd asked for special recognition in God's kingdom. And Jesus had promised they would suffer with Him. John would be exiled later. But this is what I'm saying. James and John were part of the inner circle, right? if anybody knew about an outpouring from Jesus, James and John does. I mean, if James and John could stand here today and tell you how awesome it is to be really close with Jesus, they could tell you. And yet we read in Acts chapter 12, verse 1, about that time King Herod Agrippa began to persecute some believers in the church. He had the apostle James, John's brother, killed with a sword. James and John, here we go. And James is killed and John has to deal with it. John has lost a brother. John has lost a brother simply because he pursued Jesus. Had they not pursued Jesus, they wouldn't be dead. So you have to ask yourself, if you're John, hey John, is it cool to be with Jesus? Was it cool to pursue Jesus? Was there an outpouring from Jesus, John? Yeah. What was your loss, John? My brother. Was it worth it, John? You know what he'd say. As he's exiled later on in the Isle of Patmos, he's thrown in a vat of oil. He survives that. But he's lost his brother. Verse 3, when Herod saw how much this pleased the Jewish people, he arrested Peter. It took place during the Passover celebration. They're trying to do they're celebrating, and all of this is going on. Verse 4, he imprisoned him, placing him under the guard of 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring Peter out for public trial after the Passover, but while Peter was in prison, the church prayed very earnestly for him. And that night, verse 6, before Peter was to be placed on trial, he was asleep, fastened with 2 chains between 2 soldiers. Others stood guard at the prison gate. And I've been into that story. I don't want to go into it, but I find it amazing that Peter was asleep. James has just had his head taken. And Peter is sleeping in some kind of weird we don't give Peter a lot of props sometimes, but that's an amazing moment. And Peter would tell you, I'm in prison because of Jesus. Because I'm pursuing Jesus, I'm in prison. Think of all that what Paul went through because he pursued Jesus. So I could take you to all these big, kind of earth-shatteringly, I lost my head. That's a big thing. But I want to go a bit more kind of personal. Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20. Troas is a major port where the Aegean Sea meets the northwest coast of modern-day Turkey. Paul is there. He's planning to sail to Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost. And he was going to sail from Corinth, which is a really direct trip. But we'll find out as we study this together tonight, the Jewish leaders plot against him. There's another siege on his life, and he had to go around the coast instead, skirt around the coast. So he stays in Troas, and the only reason he's in Troas is because people were trying to come after him. It wasn't his plan, it wasn't his idea, but he's in Troas for a week, and he has an opportunity to meet with the church that is there. And verse 7, if you've read this story, it's Eutychus. It's funny because it's one of my favorite stories because Paul preaches all night, and you can use that. I will comfort you with this. I read this, and I thought this was pretty funny. The guy said, if you have the gift of talking all night, you should also have the gift of resurrection. So maybe that puts it in. All right, I'm going to read this story, and then we're going to go through it. Verse 7 through 12 of Acts 20. On the first day of the week, we gathered with the local believers, Luke says, to share in the Lord's Supper. Paul was preaching to them, and since he was leaving the next day, he kept talking until midnight. The upstairs room where we met was lighted with many flickering lamps. As Paul spoke on and on, a young man named Eutychus, sitting on the windowsill, became very drowsy. Finally, he fell sound asleep and dropped 3 stories to his death below. Paul went down, bent over him, took him into his arms. Don't worry, he said, he's alive. When they all went back upstairs, shared in the Lord's Supper, and ate together, Paul continued talking to them until dawn, and then he left. Meanwhile, the young man was taken home alive and well, and everyone was greatly what? Okay, so think about what's happening here, and you'll see how relevant it is to us. They took time to gather together at night. They're gathering together at night. I think there's a mixed multitude here, Jew and Gentile. maybe predominantly Gentile. They had no church building, but that didn't stop them. It's night, that didn't stop them. They didn't have a church building, so they found this upper room, they found this room in a house. Somebody has to give up their house. Somebody has to tell them. Sometimes you sign up for things you don't really know are coming, right? You said you can use my house for a little service, and they're there all night. But the house is there, and God is providing. There's a mixture probably of Jew and Gentile. And here's what you have to understand. In that day, in the culture that we're dealing with now, the common laborers, the slaves, there was no day off. The day wasn't a day where the Jews did Sabbath and all of that, but to these common workers, to the people, to the slaves, in where we're at now in Acts 20, they had to work all day, so they met at night. That sounds like a problem we face, right? Do I go? I've worked all day. And see, that's what I'm saying. We talk about paying a price for Jesus and whopping off someone's head. But maybe it's much smaller than that and much more relevant to us that if I've worked all day, do I still come? Or do I say I've worked all day so I can't go? They're there. There's common laborers, there's slaves, there's no day off, but they would come that night to worship. And Eutychus, to be fair, the whole scene is kind of set up for something to happen. They didn't have windows in it. They had those, I don't know what you call them, but there was no windows in the windows. They had the wooden shutters, whatever. So if they're open, there's nothing stopping you. The flickering lamps, they give off oily. It's late, it's midnight. I think the idea is if you're going to fall asleep, at least still be here, right? He got tired and he falls out the window, but I think it's really cool that he's there, right? The indication is he's tired and he's fighting it. The way that it's written in the language, he kept fighting it. He kept fighting this sleep. I know none of you have ever done it, but some people fight sleep in church, and And so he's there. And this idea is, do you understand? And we'll get into this, but they came because they wanted to offer God something. Why did you come tonight? Think about why you come. And there's two sides to it, and if we only do one side of it, we'll be messed up. You should come to offer God something. You should come to offer others something. An encouragement, a fellowship, a prayer, just friendship, whatever. We come tonight to offer something. Yes, something to each other, and that's really important, but it's not about me giving to you. First and foremost, it's about me giving to who? Yeah, I come to give, to offer to God. Sometimes just being here says something to God. God understands that. You don't have to say, God, I'm tired. He knows that, right? God, I'm in no fit emotional state to be there. But he knows. He knows. And so they come to offer the Lord something. And we'll see in this culture what they're doing in this church at this point. It's really cool. But as they offer something, and some of them are tired, some of them would be hungry, some of them would be poor, some of them, however their life is, they don't just come to offer what they have, but they come to receive something from who? In a small, small part, they come to receive from each other, physically. But they come to receive something from God. And some slaves and some poor people, they say, would go hungry all week. And so what they did in these settings, what they did on this first day, what they did at this church was they gathered for a love or an agape feast. I didn't realize how biblical we were, but that's a potluck. Maybe that's where it comes from. But that's what it is. It's a potluck dinner. It's a love feast. Do you see? That's the whole point. That's kind of what that is over there, right? Apart from we're not bringing food. But the point is that, do you see, everyone was to bring something and everybody gained out of it. Does that think how important that love feast was to people who didn't eat very much. To people who were down on their luck. And this idea was, I come, yes, to eat together, and everybody would bring, and they would all share whatever they have. And that's what Paul's talking about in Corinthians. When they're messing up the Lord's Supper, they're eating and they're keeping it to themselves, and they've messed it all up. And this love feast is to celebrate God and his provision and his power. And they would come and everybody would eat. Everybody would eat. It wasn't, grab as much as you can. They would eat, and it was this love feast, this potluck. That would sustain them, that would meet needs, and I think it met some real physical needs. Like there was hungry people, they say, that didn't eat much until that night. So it was an important moment in their week. And they would gather, they would fellowship for the Lord's Supper. I think both are in here, that they would have this love feast, and not only that, but they would break bread together. So there's this fellowship, there's this amazing moment of church where they come together and they celebrate, and just as they have this love feast, this agape love feast, this God-type love, they celebrate the Lord's Supper, and they go back to the gospel and who Jesus is and what he's done. So Paul is there, and Paul is going the next day. And it's amazing. You know what you don't want to do before you leave the next day to travel? Stay up all night. And we'll see in a minute that Paul, you know what's crazy? Read verse 13. And I hadn't figured this until I studied it and someone pointed it out. Paul went by what? Luke says we traveled by ship, but Paul went by, what does that mean? He walked. Dude's been up all night, preaching, teaching. Why does he walk? He could have got on a ship. Why is he walking? He's walking because when they walked, people could walk with him. Think about that. He's got to be tired. And yet there was this fellowship, this kinship, and he's leaving. And so it was like they were soaking up every last minute, and he would walk. And I forget how many miles it is, but it's crazy, more than I wanted to do, especially after that. And Paul is just this amazing shepherd who is, he's not even really their pastor. He's just passing through. But he's ministering to them. He's available, and he's walking. And you think, man, God, you gave him some amazing power and determination and motivation. Simply what these people did, they come for a love feast, right? They come to take communion. They come to hear from Paul, which is an amazing thing. But they're simply putting themselves under the teaching of the Word of God. I don't know that it's just straight preaching either. Look at what it says. On the first day of the week, verse 7, we gathered with the local believers. So Paul and Luke and they gathered with the believers to share in the Lord's Supper and to eat together. Paul was preaching to them, and he was leaving the next day, so he kept talking till midnight. He knew he was leaving. He wanted to tell them and teach them, and I don't think that's just to get minutes. I think Paul sees and Paul loves them, and Paul is trying to just coach them up as much as he can. And he spoke until midnight. And I think there's this idea of him speaking and them asking questions. And nobody was wanting to leave. Nobody was looking at the watch. Nobody was They just sat under the teaching of the Word of God. They didn't come and eat and leave. They didn't just come and eat. They were under the teaching of the Word of God. They knew that's what they were coming for. Part of this is interesting. When I was studying this, they make a deal about why the lights are on. Verse 8, the upstairs room where we met was lighted with many flickering lamps. There's conjecture as to why the room was lighted. And part of the problem for Eutychus and others is there's a lot of oil expelled from that, and it kind of just makes you even more drowsy, right? But they were accusing in that day Christians of doing untoward things. Like they would hide in the dark. Like if you have to do things in the dark, probably something up with that, right? And so they were being accused of being kind of sneaky, and this is, I honestly, after reading this, I honestly believe this is their moment to say, we're not afraid, we're not doing anything wrong, we're proud in the middle of the night. I know there's some practical things about having lights. to show who we are and to show what we're doing. They weren't hiding it. In that time, in that place, they're risking their reputation. You imagine all that's going on, and they're looking foolish, and they're up all night. What are these people doing? They've got all kinds of people in that place, Jew and Gentile, and who do they think they are? But they didn't care. They didn't care about time. They didn't care about their reputation. Paul, in verse 3, it says he stayed for 3 months. He was preparing to sail back to Syria, and there's this plot by the Jews against his life. Paul, they in just one context, in one night, they gave willingly of their time. Now, I'm trying to make a point. You might say, what are you going on about? They gave up one night. But tell me, that's not a problem in our culture. You see, you're going to catch yourself in a weird moment. You're going to tell me it's one night. What's the big deal? Okay, then I'll throw it back to you. It's one night. Where is everyone? You see, one night in this culture is perceived, it's not very much. I'm not saying that. But it's perceived in our mind to be, a Wednesday night? Are you joking? Now, you all get A's, you're here. Well done. You must be the good ones. But do you see how crazy it is? That's what we're up against. We're not getting our heads chopped off yet. Although it's probably closer than we want to admit. We're not getting run out of town. Lots of us aren't ruining our reputation for being here tonight. But we've got into this idea that, man, going 3 times a week, that's just crazy. That's crazy. I mean, listen, we're abnormal. I don't know if you knew that, but most places want to get in and out quick, want to go once a week. That's it. That's the whole philosophy. And they'll have to deal with that at the end. That's on them. But we act like all of this time. I mean, look, all of us, if we stayed till 2, 3 o'clock on a Sunday, that would be all over Macon. My reputation would be shot more than it is. But you see at night, they wanted to be there. They gave willingly of their time, their energies, their resource. Why? Why would you do that? Why are we going to this person's house and staying till midnight? Notice what it doesn't say. At 10 o'clock, they all left. This is kind of like 12 noon here, right? They didn't leave. No. What are the chances of us going to midnight tonight and not anybody leaving? I can tell. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. What's the chances anyone else would be here but me? I don't want to know. All right. But Paul, walking afterwards, giving his time, he spent a week in a place he didn't know he was going to be because of this threat from the Jews. And Paul is still preaching with the lights on. Wouldn't you be like, can we go covert a bit? I'm fed up of getting attacked. He don't do it. Look, they gave up, and this is, again, is this big deal or not? They gave up sleep. They gave up sleep. They gave up sleep and rest. What they did was they said, we don't need to sleep, I guess. We don't need physical rest. They did that for fellowship. They did that because they were getting something from being there. They wanted to be, they could have left. They could have left but these people stayed. They gave up sleep, they gave up rest for fellowship with God, for fellowship with Paul, for fellowship with each other. Yeah, and by the way, if you're having a love feast and you're eating, that even adds to the more I want to sleep, right? They gave up sleep. But do you see what they got? I want you to see this. That whilst it is cool, it is noble, but at the end of the day, if you stand in front of Jesus and you say, I gave up sleep one night for you, it's hardly going to be like, what? Wow. I mean, have you ever thought what we'd say? It's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? What did you give? Well, I stayed till, yeah, great, thank you. All of it, look, when they're in this room and Paul is speaking to them, verse 8, the upstairs room where we met was lighted with many flickering lamps. And Paul spoke on and on. He just kept talking and they were there. But what did they do that was absurd? See, all of these things are normal activities for Christians. Now, not staying till midnight and not losing, but this is what we still do, isn't it? Okay, now we got church buildings, but you come, you listen to a message, you fellowship. We've even done it tonight. We ate. It's like we're doing the same thing. These are not abnormal activities that just Christians back then did. And so you ask, did they give something? Yeah, they gave something. Did God bless them? I want you to see this, because it would be easy to read this passage and think, I'm glad I wasn't there. If we ever go till dawn, miss me on that. I'm not interested in midnight. I'm not interested. I've got better things to do, more important things to do. And you know what most of us would say? I would stay. I really would. Yeah, there you go. But I want you to see that though these were regular type things, but God blesses them, because we talked about in Gideon, and I believe it even more, that God blesses when you give to him. Do you think God is going to bless you by even showing up? And maybe you don't have much, maybe you're poor, but in honor of him and for the sake of others, you take a very small dish to this fellowship. Is that worth anything to God? You see, it's not who made the best casserole. It's not who brought the biggest portion. I don't know who the most tired or poor person was there that night, but they got together. They followed this feast. They would meet. The early church met a lot. Every day they were meeting, but they set aside on the first day this special moments. And God blesses them, and he blesses them absurdly. I mean, if you come and say the cost was, I had to stay till after midnight, and then I want you to see what they got out of this. Because maybe it'll change our understanding. Because maybe we have no problem seeing what the cost is, and we fail to really think about the benefit. How many of you start a diet concentrating on the cost with no benefit? How many of you start investing in something knowing how much it's going to cost you with giving little regard to the benefits? You wouldn't. How many of you go into a marriage with thinking about all the costs and no benefit? Why do we do that? Why do we think in church that that's too costly? That's too much. Oh, look, sometimes it is going to be costly. Sometimes it is going to be a lot. But man, the Lord doesn't owe any of us anything. The Lord's not in debt to any of us. You think you'll say to God, you owe me? Can God, even at midnight, see people worshiping still? Does Paul get anything out of it? Because everyone would say, there's nobody, no doctor says this is a good way to live. Just work all night and then get to walking. And yet what Paul understood, and what these people who wanted to walk with Paul and these people who stayed, they understood that God was going to bless them. And he blesses them in this crazy way. But what I'm trying to tell you is this. When you give to God, little, small, whatever it is, emotionally, spiritually, physically, financially, when you give to God, he always, always, always responds. Always. You don't know what, when, how, but I'm telling you, when you give, he gives. Every single time. And I'll tell you this. His offerings back are always superior to our offerings to him. So think that night, I gave you 10 hours, I gave you a casserole, I gave whatever it might be. I gave you worship, I gave you prayer, I gave you my attention. And Paul's about to leave them. But Jesus is about to show up in an amazing way. He doesn't show up physically. But Jesus is about to show up. What do you suppose Paul is probably talking about when he's about to leave them? And why does he keep on going on and on and on? Because he can't stop talking about who? And Jesus. And primarily his what? His death, his burial, his resurrection, his coming again. Again, just quickly, what losses do you think they incurred that night? Think about that for a moment. What if you said, this is the losses I incurred for being in this place tonight? This is what it cost me. My favorite TV show, right? Time with my whoever. Even tonight, as we're here, what are our losses? What losses did you incur? I mean, what did you miss out on because you're here? And before we say they're not great losses, and they're not great losses. But again, we act like they're huge losses. We act like I could have spent time. I had planned to go somewhere, but I guess I'll go to church. Do you see, we live in this culture where we think we're given a lot, where there's like a huge loss. And because we think they're huge losses, and because we don't understand the benefit, we never reach our potential. Because if Wednesday night or Sunday morning or a life group or giving a tithe or reading the scripture or praying or fellowshipping or whatever you witnessing or whatever you want to make it, if all we see that is as a huge loss, and man, if I just give a little bit, that gets me so, like I should be rewarded, we'll never reach our potential. So here, again, what losses did they have? But here's a bigger question. Here's a more exciting question. What gains did they receive? By simply pursuing God that night, what did they gain? What was the number one thing they gained, do you think? Was it physical? Did they walk out there with more money? Did they walk out any better circumstances? Were they feeling better? They may have felt physically worse. They're all tired. What did they get? Well, that's a good one. Yes. God's favor. But how did he give them favor? See, again, hey, I'll trade you 10 hours for $100. Okay, all right, hold on. Their relationship grew. 100% with who? Whose relationship grew? Okay, so the people, that 100%. So the people there grew in fellowship with Paul, they grew in fellowship with each other, and more importantly, they grew in fellowship with Jesus because of what's happening, and we'll go through it. So, again, all right, so they grew in fellowship with God and with each other. Is that possible that that's true for Wednesday nights? So again, we come back to, where is everyone? Sunday nights, where is everyone? Sunday, this is, look again, why is it, yes, you're the choir, I get it, you shouldn't feel convicted, just take this easy, just go and shout at someone else, all right. But why, but if we believe that, I mean, why do you come here? That's why we're coming, to grow in relationship with you. Can you do it outside? Yeah, you can grow. But man, outside, God has planned it and ordained it to be this fellowship, this unique fellowship. Israel was to have this unique fellowship. Now the church is to have this unique fellowship. What did you say, Catherine? Do you remember? 100%. They grew in fellowship. They grew in spiritual encouragement. Let's look at what it says. Verse 9. Paul speaks on and on. A young man named Eutychus sitting on the windowsill. I just want you to put yourself there. This story leaves me right for, this is you, Anan, I get it. But besides that, he's sitting on this windowsill. He becomes very drowsy. Finally, he's been fighting this. He fell sound asleep and drops what? 3 stories to his death. Look, you know what it says to it? People want to be like, he wasn't really dead. You know what death means? If he wasn't dead, they could have said he was close to dying. See, people want to make it less of a miracle. Like, Paul heard his heartbeat, and that's why he's like, don't worry. Bunk him. He fell from, if you want to try it. Fall from 3 stories, we'll see how many die. And not only would he die, but what would happen? He'd break what? Yeah. See, it's not just his death. God doesn't just restore him back to life and say, sorry, old boy, you're going to have to be in a wheelchair. God doesn't just resuscitate, give him his life back. He heals him of everything. He didn't walk out with black eyes and bruises and broken bones. He's completely healed. This is a miracle. You put yourself there. This is a prime example of watch what you miss, because you never know when the Spirit's going to bust out loose. Oh, it's just a Wednesday night. Maybe it's a Wednesday night where 50 people out of the 100 come to Jesus and you want to be there. God doesn't tell us when he's going to show up. If they had said, do you want to see a miracle tonight? Guy falling. You know how much more people, they can only fit so many in that room. But you know how many more people they could have got if they knew what was going to happen, what was going to happen? I mean, people will come out to see a guy fall 3 levels and walk out of there. They will. I guarantee you, if we could promise that would have happened tonight, more people would be in here, people we hadn't ever seen. Now, whoever volunteers to jump out, I'm not sure who that is. But put yourself in this crazy situation. It's kind of a regular service, though it's going on. And he drops 3 stories to his death. The New Living here doesn't really do it justice. What would happen if someone died in here? And I was like, just hold on. I mean, look, you need less of an excuse for that to get out of here, right? I mean, someone's just dead on the floor. Imagine if we're like, hey, wait, I'm only on point 2. Guy falls. You would think there would be somewhat of a commotion, right? Somewhat of a disturbance. Somewhat of a didn't see that coming. And Paul simply goes down. No fear. No acknowledgement of go home. One time when we were in the hotel, the fire alarm went off. You'll really see the godly side of people taking care of everyone and scarping out first, right? One of our little kids had pulled the fire. You know, I was nowhere near done. You know how much more of my sermon I got to preach when they'd all left out of the fire alarm? That was that done. And yet Paul, you remember with Elisha? What it really means is he just went over his body. Hand to hand, face to face. Like the kid would be laying there and Paul just stretched. And where his head was, Paul's head was. And where his arms were, Paul's arms were. And where his leg, he just got on top of him. It's not a normal activity, right? I don't advise you to try it at the funeral home. I mean, if it works, let us know. But he's there, and he gets down. This says he got down, he bent over him, and he took him into his arms. But that doesn't really do it justice. He's over the man, and he just says, hey, no problem, don't worry. He's what? Why is that so amazing? Do you see, this is what God, I believe this with all my heart. What could be better than God to do this alongside Paul's teaching? I believe God is, through Paul teaching, probably about the gospel, who knows what he's speaking. You imagine telling people about the power of Jesus and then seeing that. Like whatever Paul was teaching them, whatever he was saying about Jesus, whatever they were learning about the Word of God and the Spirit of God and the hope of God and the fellowship of God, when Eutychus comes back to life, who's there saying, God doesn't really have much power, does he? You see how, God was basically, it was like show and tell. Paul told and God just showed hey, by the way, I'm going to prove it. People want to make this like the resurrection. And look, there's similarities, but I think you can get to. But, man, this guy is dead. He's dead. And Paul says, don't worry, he's good. He didn't resuscitate him like, the old boy was still. Well, that doesn't make sense either, because he went home fine. He was alive, and what does it say? He was taken home alive and what? Injured? Yeah. And listen to it. They all went back upstairs. Okay, this is a really difficult question. What does that mean? If they all had to go back upstairs, what does it mean they'd done? There you go. What are they going downstairs for? How many people were you like, just stay here, he'll be back with us? I mean, how many of them were like, Paul, just go do your thing, we're good. You think some people freaked out? You think some people were like, I'm not coming here again? How many people were looking at Eutychus like, what are you doing? They go back upstairs. And this is amazing. I want you to see the power in this. They shared the Lord's what? They ate together, but they shared in the Lord's what? I'm not being funny, but do you think that changes a communion service? You think if we had just seen and by the way, this wasn't hearsay. This wasn't bringing Eutychus in and saying, hey, today he was dead and now he's alive. You know what everyone had seen? They'd seen it for themselves. And this kid gets up. I'm just guessing, no one was like, oh, we're doing communion? This is so boring. What are they celebrating in communion? The death and what? And resurrection of Jesus. How hard is it to believe in the resurrection of Jesus when you've just seen that? Because one of two things happened. Either God did it or Paul did it. Or some weird voodoo did it or whatever. But how did Eutychus come back to life? With no medical attention. That's not the way. I've never seen a doctor do that, have you? He's almost dying. Just jump on him. If that was a prescription from your doctor, you'd probably change doctor, right? Hey, Nick, just lay there. We're going to just jump on top of you. It'll be fine. Especially if the doctor's 400, right? Just like, no worries. And they're taking communion. Do you see the power in this? I don't have proof of this. But I'd go out on a limb and say this was the best communion service some of these people ever had. How'd you top that? Come back next week. Do you understand that when they were taking communion, there'd be power, there'd be joy, there'd be excitement? What? Paul's job at preaching and teaching them is so much easier. Just look. Oh, why do you follow Jesus? Exhibit A. Why do you trust in Jesus? Exhibit A. It'd get boring every question. Did you just see what happened? And do you think they were like, man, I'm tired. I wish I hadn't come. Man, I thought I was coming for fellowship, and I thought I was coming for food, and I thought, yes, I was coming to worship a little bit. But they saw resurrection power. They saw Jesus' power in the flesh that would partner with Paul's message, and I believe that God partnered it so perfectly together in unison. They saw the power. Look at what it says. They went back upstairs. They shared in the Lord's Supper. They ate together. Paul continued talking to them. Here we go. It's been till midnight, and Eutychus dies. They go back upstairs, and he talks till dawn. Service ain't over. They just keep going and going. I don't think Paul ran out of material, do you? And all of a sudden, when Jesus showed up in power like he did, you know what doesn't become so much important anymore? Your time, your agenda, your sleep, your priorities, they all change. Would you be willing to stay longer if someone would have just been resurrected from the dead? You think you'd go out and be like, man, it was too hot in there, really stuffy. You'll be all right. I just want you to think about this moment. They're eating the Lord's Supper. Communion. And Paul continues to talk to them. And then he just what? He leaves. And it says in verse 12, meanwhile, the young man was taken home. He got a reprieve. He got to go home. taken home alive and what? And everyone was greatly what? Relieved. In a strange twist of irony, you know what Eutychus means? And it's really, this is kind of what I'm talking about. It means lucky one. I'm not making that up, that's what it means. At what point do you think he's lucky? You see, if you only told half the story, we need a dude to fall off 3 floors just to see what happens. How many are signing up for that? Do you think Eutychus was the same after that? You think when the Lord asked, imagine what the Lord could ask for him. I gave you your life. Could Eutychus ever complain to God and say, that's too much? Hold on, I gave you my what? I gave you life back. Well, same's true for us. Jesus gave his life, right? and Eutychus is not lucky to the human eye. Like, I don't want to be that dude, but he's not lucky, but his life is power. If anyone knows he was dead, guess what? He does. To be absent from the body is what? So his spirit's gone, and then all of a sudden it's coming back. Now, he might wish Paul had just left him alone. Because if his spirit's gone to paradise, he probably don't want to mess around with earth again. I don't know how long he's dead for, but the spirit doesn't wait around. Once you're dead, it's gone. The young man was taken home alive and well, and everyone was greatly relieved. And then the next day, Paul just starts walking, and he starts fellowshipping with them. They saw the grace and mercy of Jesus. They saw his grace. They saw his mercy bestowed on Eutychus. They experienced worship at the Lord's Supper in a brand new way. They enjoyed fellowship. They enjoyed deep fellowship with the Lord. They enjoyed deep fellowship with each other. They would have been filled with the fruit of the Spirit. The testimony, the renown of Jesus was greatly increased. Memorial stones that night were built. If you ever doubt Jesus, if you ever doubt his power, if you ever worry about it, think of that night. And verse 12, look, they all went back upstairs. Verse 12, meanwhile the young man was taken home and everyone was greatly relieved. The people were energized. And because they were energized and because they were excited, they thought they'd give until midnight, but they kept on giving. I mean, giving to midnight was something, right? But now they gave till dawn because the resurrection energized them. Think for a second, and I want to stop and pray. But think of a second what that did for Paul and Eutychus. Why was Paul ready to walk the next day? How do you think the Apostle Paul did what he did? If you ask Paul, was that, hey, Paul, did you ever have any interesting moments around the Lord's Supper? You think Paul learned something that night? And that's what I'm telling you. Paul gave and he gave and he gave and he gave. He's walking, he's preaching, he's teaching, he's available, he's doing it for hours. Paul gave literally everything he could. And yet God gave him what? Is that a good trade? Paul, give everything you can, and I'll give you resurrection power. Paul, give me some hours, give me some walking, give me some hard situations, but I'll give you a moment where you literally have the power of God on you and you're going to raise dead people. Is it worth it? What would you do to have that kind of power? To experience, and forget to help other people, but to experience God in such an amazing, incredible way. And Eutychus would never forget that. I don't believe Eutychus was ever afraid of dying again. And it all started, and this is the point I want you to understand. It all started in a simple, mundane pursuit of God. They weren't signing up for miracle crusades. They just knew they were going to an agape feast. They were going to go and do what Christians do, hang out with each other and praise God on their prescribed day. And I said it again. I'll say it again. You never know what's going to happen at a church service. Paul had to go there for a week. Paul had to ruin all his plans because the Jews tried to kill him. And I finish with these really poignant questions. Paul was available. These people made themselves available. God is always available. The question becomes to us, are we? Are we available? Are we available to each other? Are we available to the church? Are we available to the Lord? Or do we have strict limits like that's too costly? Or are we going to say, like, imagine the people who missed that night. This wasn't a regular thing. You never hear about it again. And look, I'm not saying you have to, look, we go on vacation. I get it. You get sick. I'm not. But man, we need to do everything we can to be here when we can. Are we available? And I say we, not just you, me. Are we available? Are we pursuing fellowship? Because it was in a pursuit of fellowship that night that landed them in this whole situation. And are we paying a price? And if you really, really want to get a little bit of like spiritual kind of wake-up call, go home and write down what you think your price is. I can tell you, if you're not paying a price for the gospel, you don't know Jesus. If you can't name one price, if there's no price you're paying for being saved, you ain't saved. Everybody pays a price. And what I challenge me and what I challenge you is, go home and I'm not trying to belittle what we give, because some people give a lot. But what I am saying is this: when we kind of think we made it and we've given enough, or when we get tempted to think that's too much to give, put down Calvary, put down Jesus, put down what he's done, and then put down what you're giving. And you know what you'll find? There is nobody going to stand up and be like, well, at the cross he gave me his son. Woo! But I gave him 20 minutes. It just don't work like that. It doesn't. No one can. Look, Paul says, I only boast in the cross because that's the only thing where Paul doesn't go around like, oh, and I walked afterwards too. Are you and I willing? And here's a bigger question. Are we able to pay it? Yeah. Yeah, you're able to pay it. If you've got the Spirit and he's leading you to it, you're able to pay it. But are we paying a price for each other? Are we paying a price to get to know Jesus? Are we paying a price in our life for intimacy, for fellowship? Are we willing to? Are we willing to say, God, whenever, however, whatever, whoever, it don't matter. God, it's worth it. And look, afterwards, if they did a rerun of this, we'd all want to be there because we know what's coming. But what happens when you give and you don't know what's coming? So all of us have to be available, pursuing each other, pursuing fellowship, pursuing the Lord, and willing to pay a price. That's how the early church started. I'm willing to give what I have. I'll pay the price, you pay the price, and everyone's all right. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts before we pray?